morning, everyone.
Hello.
Got me wearing a tie this morning. It's because we're going to Brinsfield's funeral home for the viewing of our dear brother Tom Tenna
Yeah.
after church, about 2 o'clock, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we live about 20 minutes from here, so it pays to get dressed and just come the way I'm gonna go, so that's what we're doing. Well, it's good to see you all. Our lesson this morning is entitled Interceding for God's Mercy. We're gonna be in the 18th and the 19th chapter of the book of Genesis. We're starting out at the beginnings. Our objective today is going to be to understand and put into practice the truth that God readily intercedes in response to prayers of the faithful. Our golden text is Romans chapter 8, verse 26, where Paul writes this. He says, "In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express." Let's have a moment of prayer. Father, as we begin this new Sunday school quarter for the summer, I pray that your Spirit would walk with us every step of the way, that you would help us to grow and to cultivate our relationship with you in a form of intimacy. In the name of your Son, Jesus, I pray for this lesson this morning. Amen. As I mentioned in the prayer, we're starting today a new Sunday school quarter, and it's divided into 2 segments. The first segment is Great Prayers of the Bible, which might sound like how can we spend a whole half of the summer on the subject of prayers of the Bible? I think you'll see as we go through this lesson today that not only is it possible, it's valuable. Not only are we going to have that segment, but our second segment is going to be on the subject of defending the faith in a secular world, a world we find ourselves immersed in, kind of like one of the subjects of our lesson today, a fellow by the name of Lot. We find ourselves in our own Sodom and Gomorrah. And that segment will help us to understand how to defend the faith, the gospel, in that culture that we live in. We're going to begin our study this morning with an examination of Abraham's theophany, the appearance of God to Abraham. God created man, and he can assume any form he chooses at any time when he wants to communicate with man. God chose on this occasion to do what we call theophany, that is to appear to Abraham as a man. God appeared in this form because Abraham could comprehend it, and Abraham could understand talking to a man. This manifestation of God appears to be the pre-incarnate Logos, Word of God. That is, Jesus, before he took on flesh. And there were 2 others that were with him. And we learn from the text, from chapter 19 actually, that these 2 others were angels that accompanied God when he appeared to Abraham in this theophany. There's another big theological term that we use to describe these kinds of visitations, and it's anthropomorphic manifestations. Well, that comes from the language when you combine it, it's talking about promorphic, meaning like man, and it's intended to communicate the idea that it's a manifestation that is understood and perceived by man. So the theophany is an anthropomorphic manifestation. So much from the big words today. No more. It is nature, the nature of God, meaning that God takes up a form that man's senses and mind can comprehend that communicates something about his nature. These showings or manifestations take different forms throughout the Bible. For instance, Moses, you remember, when he was called and told to go to Egypt to deliver God's people, Moses saw God in the form of a burning bush that was not consumed. Now, God's not a bush, but the bush spoke to Moses. Moses could understand a burning bush. He might not have understood why it wasn't consumed, but he knew that signaled to him that it was supernatural in nature and not just a burning bush. When Jesus was addressing the Samaritan woman at the well, Jesus instructed her, and in instructing her, instructed us as well. He told her God is a spirit. In John chapter 4, verse 24, he says, God is a spirit, and his worshipers must worship him in spirit and truth. Now, this is a great revelation. It is an important revelation, something we should never pass up when we read the Gospel of John. Understand that Jesus purposefully told us through his conversation with her that God is a spirit, and if you want to communicate with God, if you want to commune with him, you must do so in spirit and truth. Now, this relates to the way God made us. On this occasion that we're studying today, God appears in the form of a wayfaring traveler, accompanied by two angels who appear to be men. And the visitors conduct themselves in keeping with the customs of the day. When they come to Abraham's tent, they don't barge in, they don't impose on him, they wait for Abraham to invite them in. And when they are invited in, they sit back and accept the accommodations that Abraham gives to them. The scriptures begin teaching us from the very beginning of this theophany. The lesson is one that instructs us on the power of intercessory prayer. First, we can see the nature of the encounter. The observance of the customs is more than incidental. It's not just the way things were done. God is waiting. God is waiting. Now think about that. It's not that a man is waiting, but God is waiting to be invited in by Abraham. And that says a lot to us about our communion with God. He is waiting for us to invite him in. Abraham eagerly pleaded with them to bless his home with their presence, and that opened the door. That gave the window of opportunity that God's Spirit needed to commune with the spirit of Abraham. Now, there's a great deal in this encounter that is instructive. And it's instructive of both God and the nature of prayer. Prayer is an essential element in spiritual warfare. You're involved in spiritual warfare whether you want to be or not. One side or the other. You're involved. Prayer is no mere ritual, or should be no mere ritual. It should be an important element of your spiritual warfare. It should not be a one-sided thing based on pleading or even on exalting God alone. Those are part of prayer. They're important in prayer, but it should not be limited to that. Prayer, instead, should be a communion of man's spirit with God, who we are told by Jesus is a spirit. God made us, and he gave us a gift we call the Spirit. God made man, he made man in his own image. Now, this is unlike what he made in the natural world in terms of animals, beasts, birds and fish and things that crawl and walk on the land. None of them were given the same kind of spirit and self-awareness that man was given. This spirit is the core of man's existence. We know who we are or what we are. When a dog looks in a mirror, he doesn't see himself. He sees a dog. And he'll bark at that dog. He might even jump up on that mirror to try to compete and battle with that dog. but he doesn't see it as himself because he doesn't have the same sense of personal existence and presence. But our spirit defines us. Our spirit is our essence, and we know because we have a spirit. The original design of man includes this capability of possessing and operating through is kind of a weak word, but we can operate through a spirit. But there's a problem. Our spirit is incomplete because of Adam's sin. The original design of man included communion between God and man. God residing in the presence of man continually. It was more than just an existence in the garden. And when Adam failed in sin, he was ejected. God wasn't ejected. And Adam lost the ability to commune directly with God as he possessed it. It's described as walking in the garden in the cool of the morning with God. He lost that. He lost that communion. When Jesus instructs the woman at the well, he was telling her a remedy for Adam's failure that she inherited, that all of us inherit. He was telling her that when we worship in spirit and truth, the communion with God that was lost in the garden is established. And we begin to experience what Adam experienced. Now, this series of lessons that we will examine over the next few weeks is about this communion that the Spirit enjoys. And we call that communion prayer. We're going to begin with observing Abraham as he vigorously accommodates his visitors. We're going to look at his preparations and understand that they are instructive of prayer. Abraham's efforts that he makes to accommodate them are rewarded with a visitation that changes his entire life. He seems to know from the beginning that these are not just travelers, not just men in the desert that met him there. He seems to know that this is a visitation from God. God intended for Abraham to discern the truth about this visitation. Abraham's response reflects his frame of mind, his openness to God's intent to commune with him. And he seems to be eager himself to commune with God. Look at all his preparations in chapter 18. They're sacrificial in nature. He bows before his visitors. He provides them with the best that his household had to offer, even shedding blood, slaying a young calf to prepare a meal of veal for his visitors. Then there is the conversation with Sarah. Sarah didn't come out to the tent. She stayed inside while they were outside. But Sarah overheard the conversation, and when she heard the promise that was given to Abraham that he surely would have a son by this time next year, Sarah mocked it. Sarah laughed. She knew how old she was. She knew how old her husband was. She knew that there's no way this is going to happen. But God called her out of it. And she denied it. She lied. She said, I didn't mock. But he said to her, you did. And the truth is, she doubted. And that's why she lied, to conceal her doubt. Now, in verse 16, Abraham learned something from God about God's plans that follow this visitation. Let's go there. Genesis 18 and verse 16 in your study text. When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Now, we know in retrospect that the purpose of the visit was twofold. First, there is this promise made of a son and the assurances that come along with that. But secondly, God is here to reveal his intentions to bring judgment to Sodom. None of this could happen if Abraham had dismissed them at the door of his tent and said goodbye as they were leaving. But you'll notice from this text that Abraham does more than that. Instead of saying goodbye at the door of the tent, Abraham performs the custom of traveling a distance with his guests. This is also instructive to us about prayer. The communion that Abraham was experiencing continued beyond the events in the tent, beyond the visitation. Abraham made a choice to continue that communion. And so it should be with our prayer as well. Prayer in the Spirit is more than the performance of some ritual. Prayer is more than the saying of certain scripted words or repetitions of formulas, incantations, counting off beads to ensure that you say the right number of special sayings. Prayer is much more than that. Yeah. Well, that's one form, but there are other religions that do similar things. Muslims carry beads, and they use it in their rituals as well. But the point is that real and genuine prayer is more than these kinds of things. Our spirit is created, and it is derived from God. Now, you probably thought I was going to say it was what it was created for, but that was not my intent. My intent is for you to understand the difference in our spirit and God's spirit. Our spirit is created. God made us. God gave us a spirit. But God has no creator. He is a spirit by nature and is not dependent on something or someone else. We are. So God is the original. He's not derived. There should be a desire in our prayer for us to have a continual communion with the one who made us, with this Spirit who spoke us into existence. Our spirit is part of our created being, and I have to emphasize, this is the important emphasis of this part of the lesson, our created being. It continues, that is, our being continues because God chooses to continue it. Our constant, perpetual existence is a product of the will of God being exercised in his created cosmos. And we have, as a result, a constant, continuous need for communion. Abraham had that need, and that's why he didn't stop at the door of his tent. He continued to walk along with God because he had this need for fulfillment. As a being with the Spirit, he needed that communion with his Creator. There should be that kind of desire in our prayer. Communion, that is. Continuing. As with Abraham, we should be content with bidding the Spirit of God goodbye at the end of a visit. Verse 16 says, Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. And that is the signal to us of how our walk should go. With him. Walking with him. Continually. We need to continue with him as Abraham accompanied his guests. We call this continuing, in our customary Christian language, tarrying before the Lord. Tarrying. You know, we have all kinds of things in our Christian vocabulary that the rest of the world doesn't quite understand. But when we talk about tarrying with the Lord, we're talking about continuing in the Spirit. You know, once you get past all the pleadings, and there's nothing wrong with those pleadings, he wants those. Once you get past all the words of praise and exaltation, there is this thing we call tarrying with the Lord in prayer. which means waiting and listening and being open to him and his communication with you. That's what communion is communication. The spirit of man knows that when he is in the presence of God, he is communing with God. And the spirit of man does not wish this experience to end. The flesh does. The flesh is the one you have to compel to spend the time in prayer, to stay awake, to stop complaining about the pain and the discomfort of the position that you find yourself in, but to surrender to the presence of the Lord. Verse 17, 18, and 19. Only 17 is in your student's manual. Then the Lord said, this is after he has accompanied the Lord full ways, after he is tarried with the Lord. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Now this is not a conversation between the Lord and Abraham. Instead, this is an opening up of the heart and the mind of God to the reader. It's for you. It's for me. Because God has chosen by his Spirit to use his instruction and communications with Abraham to communicate to us. Abraham is the beneficiary of a covenant. Never lose sight of that. Abraham didn't do something special or spectacular that caused God to make a deal with him. God graciously chose Abraham and gave Abraham this covenant. The promise of a son is the beginning of the fulfillment of that covenant. Because God told him he would make a great nation out of him. And that nation would have influence and power that would extend throughout the ages and around the world. God made that promise to Abraham, not because Abraham was special, but because God chose him. It was his election. It was grace. Abraham is going to have a role in all this, though. And in this communication to us in these verses, God tells us that Abraham is going to be teaching his children. He is going to be telling them and instilling in them a sense of right and wrong. Now, all of this is before the giving of the law. The law hasn't been given. That doesn't come along until Moses is in the scene. Abraham is going to hold his children accountable to a sense of right and wrong that is innate, that is in him, that is a part of his nature as a spirit being. We all have that in our nature. We have a natural understanding of right and wrong. You see this first in children. When they first lie to you, they're ashamed of it and they hide it. And when they get caught, they deny it. Because they know. They haven't read the book of the law. They don't know what the 10 Commandments are at the age of 2, but they do know what right and wrong is. Because God gave us that capability in our spirit. And he is saying here that Abraham is going to be teaching his children these principles of right and wrong that he has learned from his own nature and the nature around him. It's because of these factors that God chooses to reveal to Abraham his plans for Sodom and Gomorrah. Because Abraham has this innate sense of right and wrong. It's important that he understand what God is about to do. Verse 20 and 21. Oh, thanks, Bob. I think we caught it in time.
Yes.